Uh-oh. Shit. I better reset. So my plan is not to listen to music, more like to listen to an audiobook while I'm farming here. bows down. Come on. Be more nice. Shit. Really depleted bows. Resistance potions. Okay, let's not show DM. Try 10. So. And audiobook. Bam. Let it run.
Chapter 132. The Broken Circle. I'd been busy for more than an hour when the sun finally peered over.
Is it right? No. It feels for me like... Wasn't I an even number? 150 or something like this? I really have to check the VODs. Yeah, 150. Okay, there I say it. Ugh. Okay. What? Oh, there's not much left from the book. Let's go.
Chapter 150. Folly. Spring term rolled on. Contrary to what I'd expected, Denna didn't make any public performances in Imre. Instead, she headed north to Annalyn after a handful of days. But this time she made a special trip to Anchors to tell me she was leaving. I found myself strangely flattered by this and couldn't help but feel it was a sign that things were not entirely sour between us. The Chancellor fell ill just as the term was coming to a close. Though I didn't know him very well, I liked Hermer. Not only did I find him to be a surprisingly easygoing teacher when he had been teaching me Ilish, but he had been kind to me when I was new to the university. Nevertheless, I wasn't particularly worried. Arwyll and the staff of the Medica could do everything just short of bringing people back from the dead. But days passed and no news came from the Medica. Rumor said he was too weak to leave his bed, plagued with spikes of fever that threatened to burn away his powerful arcanist's mind. When it became apparent he wouldn't be able to resume his duties as Chancellor anytime soon, the Masters gathered to decide who would fill his place. Perhaps permanently, should his condition worsen. And to make a painful story short, Heme was appointed Chancellor. After the shock wore off, it was easy to see why. Kilvin, Arwyll, and Lauren were too busy to take up the extra duties. The same could be said for Mandrag and Dahl to a lesser extent. That left Elodine, Brandir, and Heme. Elodine didn't want it and was generally regarded as too erratic to serve, and Brandir always faced whatever direction Heme's own wind was blowing. So Heme gained the Chancellor's chair. While I found it irritating, it had little impact on my day-to-day life. The only precaution I took was to step with extra care around even the least of the university's laws, knowing if I were put on the horns now, Heme's vote would count doubly against me. As admissions approached, Master Hermer remained weak and fevered. So it was with a knot of sour dread in my stomach that I prepared for my first admissions interview with Heme as Chancellor. I went through the questioning with the same careful artifice I'd maintained for the last 2 terms. I hesitated and made a few mistakes, earning a tuition of 20 talents or so. Enough to earn some money, but not enough to embarrass myself too badly. Heme, as always, asked double-sided or misleading questions designed to trip me, but that was nothing new. The only real difference seemed to be that Heme smiled a great deal. It wasn't a pleasant smile either. The masters had their usual muted conference, then Heme read my tuition. 50 talent. Apparently the Chancellor had greater control over these things than I had ever known. I forced myself to bite my lip to keep from laughing, and arranged my face in a dejected expression as I made my way to the basement of Hollows, where the Versa kept his counting room. Riem's eyes brightened at the sight of my tuition slip. He disappeared into his back room, and returned in a moment with an envelope of thick paper. I thanked him, and returned to my room at anchor, maintaining my morose expression all the way. Once I had the door closed, I tore open the heavy envelope and poured its contents into my hand. 2 gleaming gold marks worth 10 talents each. I laughed then. Laughed until my eyes watered and my sides ached. Then I drew on my best suit of clothes and gathered my friends, Willem and Simon, Faire and Mola. I sent a runner boy to Imre with an invitation to Davy and Threep. Then I hired a 4-horse carriage and had the lot of us driven across the river to Imre. We stopped by the Aeolian. Denna wasn't there, but I collected Diok instead, and we made our way to the King's Arms, an establishment of the sort no self-respecting student could ever afford. The doorman looked the motley lot of us over scornfully, as if he would object, but Threep frowned his best gentleman's frown, and ushered all of us safely inside. Then commenced a night of pleasant decadence, the likes of which I have hardly seen since. We ate and drank, and I paid for everything happily. The only water on the table was in the hand bowl. In our cups there was only old vintage wine, dark scutton, cool metheglin, sweet brand, and every toast we drank was to Heme's folly. Chapter 151. Locks. Kvothe drew a deep breath and nodded to himself.
Let's stop there,
He said,
money in my pocket for the first time in my life, surrounded by friends. That's a good place to end for the night.
He idly rubbed his hands together, right hand massaging the left absent-mindedly.
If we go much farther, things get dark again.
Chronicler picked up the short stack of finished pages and tapped them on the table, squaring their corners before resting the half-finished page on top. He opened his leather satchel, removed the bright green crown of holly and slid the pages inside. Then he screwed shut the inkwell and began to dismantle and clean all the pieces of his pen. Kvothe stood and stretched. Then he gathered up the empty plates and cups, carrying them into the kitchen. Bast merely sat, his expression blank. He didn't move. He hardly seemed to be breathing. After several minutes, Chronicler began to dart glances in his direction. Kvothe came back into the room and frowned.
Bast,
he said. Bast slowly turned his eyes to look at the man behind the bar. Chef's wake is still going on, Quoth said. There's not much cleaning up to do tonight. Why don't you head over for the end of it? They'll be glad to have you. Bast considered for a moment and shook his head. I don't think so, Resh, he said, his voice flat. I'm not really in the mood. He pushed himself out of his chair and made his way across the room towards the stairs without looking either of them in the eye. I'll just turn in. The hard sounds of his footsteps retreated slowly into the distance, followed by the sound of a closing door. Chronicler watched him go, then turned to look at the red-haired man behind the bar. Quoth was looking at the stairway too, his eyes concerned. He's just had a rough day, he said, sounding as if he was speaking to himself as much as his guest. He'll be fine tomorrow. Wiping off his hands, Quoth walked around the bar and headed to the front door. Do you need anything before you turn in? He asked. Chronicler shook his head and began fitting his pen back together. Quoth locked the front door with a large brass key, then turned to Chronicler. I'll leave this in the lock for you, he said, in case you wake up early and feel like having a walk or some sort. I don't tend to sleep very much these days. He touched the side of his face where a bruise was beginning to mottle his jaw. But tonight I might make an exception. Chronicler nodded and shouldered his satchel. Then he delicately picked up his holly crown and headed up the stairs. Alone in the common room, Quoth swept the floor methodically, catching all the corners. He finished the dishes, washed the tables and the bar, and rolled down all the lamps but one, leaving the room dimly lit and full of flickering shadow. For a moment he looked at the bottles behind the bar, then turned and made his own slow climb upstairs. Bast stepped slowly into his room, closing the door behind himself. He moved quietly through the dark to stand before the hearth. Nothing but ash and cinder remained from the morning's fire. Bast opened the wood bin, but there was nothing inside except a thick layer of chaff and chips at the bottom. The dim light from the window glinted in his dark eyes and showed the outline of his face as he stood motionless, as if trying to decide what to do. After a moment, he let the lid of the bin fall closed, wrapped himself in a blanket, and folded himself onto a small couch in front of the empty fireplace. He sat there for a long while, eyes open in the dark. There was a faint scuffle outside his window, then nothing, then a faint scraping. Bast turned and saw a dark shape outside moving in the night. Bast went for it, then slid smoothly from the couch to stand in front of the fireplace, eyes still on the window, his hands hunted carefully across the top of the mantel. There was another scrape at the window, louder this time. Bast's eyes darted away from the window to the mantel, and he caught up something with both hands. Metal gleamed faintly in the dim moonlight as he crouched, his body as tense as a coiled spring. For a long moment there was nothing. No sound. No movement outside the window or in the darkened room. Tap, tap, tap. It was a faint noise, but perfectly clear in the stillness of the room. There was a pause. Then the noise came again, sharp and insistent against the window glass. Tap, 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 tap. Bast sighed. Relaxing out of his tense crouch, he walked over to the window, through the drop bar, and opened it. My window doesn't have a lock, Chronicler said petulantly. Why does yours? Obvious reasons, Bast said. Can I come in? Bast shrugged and moved back toward the fireplace while Chronicler climbed awkwardly through the window. Bast struck a match and lit a lamp on a nearby table, then carefully set a pair of long knives on the mantel. One was slender and as sharp as a blade of grass, the other keen and as graceful as a thorn. Chronicler looked around as light swelled to fill the room. It was large, with rich wood paneling and thick carpets. 2 lounging couches faced each other in front of the fireplace, and one corner of the room was dominated by a huge canopy bed with deep green curtains. There were shelves filled with pictures, trinkets, and ornaments, locks of hair wrapped in ribbon, whistles carved from wood, dried flowers, rings of horn and leather and woven grass. A hand-dipped candle with leaves pressed into the wax. And in what was obviously a recent addition, holly boughs decorated parts of the room. One long garland ran along the headboard of the bed, and another was strung along the mantel, weaving in and out through the handles of a pair of bright leaf-bladed hatchets hanging there. Bast sat back in front of the cold fireplace and wrapped a rag blanket around his shoulders like a shawl. It was a chaos of ill-matching fabric and faded color, except for a bright red heart sewn squarely in the center. "We need to talk," Chronicler said softly. Bast shrugged, his eyes fixed dully on the fireplace. Chronicler took a step closer. "I need to ask you." "You don't have to whisper," Bast said without looking up. "We're on the other side of the inn. Sometimes I have guests. It used to keep him awake, so I moved to this side of the building. There are 6 solid walls between my room and his." Chronicler sat on the edge of the other couch, facing Bast. "I need to ask about some of the things you said tonight. About the Cathay." "We shouldn't talk about the Cathay." Bast's voice was flat and leaden. "It's not helpful." "The Scythe, then," Chronicler said. "He said if they knew about this story, they'd kill everyone involved. Is that true?" Bast nodded, eyes still on the fireplace. "They'd burn this place and salt the earth behind it." The Chronicler looked down, shaking his head. "I don't understand this fear you have of the thing," he said. "Well," Bast said, "evidence seems to indicate that you're not terribly smart." Chronicler frowned and waited patiently. Bast sighed, finally pulling his eyes away from the fireplace. "Think. The Faire knows everything you're ever going to do, everything you're going to say." "That makes it an irritating conversationalist," Chronicler said, but not. Bast's expression went suddenly furious. "Dien vehat! En fayun vehat! Dolorentes!" He spat almost incoherently. He was trembling, clenching and unclenching his hands. Chronicler went pale at the venom in Bast's voice, but he didn't flinch. "You're not angry at me," he said calmly, looking Bast in the eye. "You're just angry, and I happen to be nearby." Bast glared at him but said nothing. Chronicler leaned forward. "I'm trying to help, you know that, right?" Bast nodded sullenly. "That means I need to understand what's going on." Bast shrugged. His sudden flare of temper had burned itself out, leaving him listless again. "Growth seems to believe you about the Cathay," Chronicler said. "He knows the hidden turnings of the world," Bast said. "And what he doesn't understand, he's quick to grasp." Bast's fingers flicked idly at the edges of the blanket. "And he trusts me. But doesn't it seem contrived? The Cathay gives a boy a flower, one thing leads to another, and suddenly there's a war." Chronicler made a dismissive motion. "Things don't work that way. It's too much coincidence." "What coincidence?" Bast gave a short sigh. "A blind man has to stumble through a cluttered room. You don't. You use your eyes and pick the easy way. It's clear to you as anything. The Faire can see the future, all futures. We have to fumble through. It doesn't. It merely looks and picks the most disastrous path. It is the stone that stirs the avalanche. It is the cough that starts the plague. But if you know the Faire is trying to steer you," Chronicler said, "you would just do something else. He gives you the flower, and you just sell it." Bast shook his head. "The Cathay would know. You can't second-guess a thing that knows your future. Say you sell the flower to the prince. He uses the flower to heal his betrothed. A year later, she catches him diddling the chambermaid, hangs herself in disgrace, and her father launches an attack to avenge her honor. Bast spread his hands helplessly. You still get civil war. But the young man who sold the flower stays safe. Probably not, Bast said grimly. More likely he gets drunk as a lord, catches the pox, then knocks over a lamp and sets half the city on fire. You're just making things up to prove your point, Chronicler said. You're not actually proving anything. Why do you want to prove anything to you? Bast asked. Why would I care what you think? Be happy in your silly little ignorance. I'm doing you a favor by not telling you the truth. What truth is that? Chronicler said, plainly irritated. Bast gave a weary sigh and looked up at Chronicler, his expression utterly empty of all hope. I would rather fight Haliax himself, he said. I'd rather face all the Chandrian together than have 10 words of conversation with the Cathay. This gave Chronicler a bit of a pause. They'd kill you, he said. Something in his voice made it a question. Yes, Bast said. Even so. Chronicler stared at the dark-haired man sitting across from him, wrapped in a rag blanket. Stories taught you to fear the Cathay, he said, disgust plain in his voice. And that fear is making you stupid. Bast shrugged, his empty eyes drifting back to the non-existent fire. You bore me, manling. Chronicler stood up, stepped forward, and slapped Bast hard across the face. Bast's head rocked to the side, and for a moment he seemed too shocked to move. Then he came to his feet in a blur of motion, blanket flying from his shoulders. He grabbed Chronicler roughly by the throat, teeth bared, his eyes a deep, unbroken blue. Chronicler looked him squarely in the eye. The Cathay set all of this in motion, he said calmly. It knew you would attack me, and terrible things will come of it. Bast's furious expression went stiff, his eyes widening. The tension left his shoulders as he let go of Chronicler's throat. He started to sink back down onto the cushions of the couch. Chronicler drew back his arm and slapped him again. If anything, the sound was even louder than before. Bast bared his teeth again, then stopped. His eyes darted to Chronicler, then away. The Cathay knows you fear it, Chronicler said. It knows I would use that knowledge against you. It's still manipulating you. If you don't attack me, terrible things will come of it. Bast froze as if paralyzed, trapped halfway between standing and sitting. Are you listening to me? Chronicler said. Are you finally awake? Bast looked up at the scribe with an expression of confused amazement. A bright red mark was blossoming on his cheek. He nodded, sinking slowly back onto the couch. Chronicler drew back his arm. What will you do if I hit you again? Beat 10 colors of guts out of you, Bast said earnestly. Chronicler nodded and sat back down on his couch. I will, for the sake of argument, accept that the Cathay knows the future. That means it can control many things. He raised a finger. But not everything. The fruit you ate today was still sweet in your mouth, wasn't it? If the Faire is as malicious as you say, it would harm you in every way possible, but it cannot. It could not keep you from making your Reshi laugh this morning. It could not keep you from enjoying the sun on your face or kissing the rosy cheeks of farmers' daughters, could it? A flicker of a grin found Bast's face. I kissed more than that, he said. That, Chronicler said firmly, is my point. It cannot poison everything we do. Bast looked thoughtful, then sighed. You're right in a way, he said, but only an idiot sits in a burning house and thinks everything is fine because fruit is still sweet. Chronicler made a point of looking around the room, The inn doesn't look like it's on fire to me. Bast looked at him incredulously. The whole world is burning down, he said. Open your eyes. Chronicler frowned. Even ignoring everything else, he said, pulling ahead. Felurian let him go. She knew he'd spoken with the Faire. Surely she wouldn't have loosed him on the world unless she had some way to guard against its influence. Bast's eyes brightened at the thought, then dimmed almost immediately. He shook his head. You're looking for depth in a shallow stream, he said. I don't follow you, Chronicler demanded. What possible reason could she have for letting him go if he was truly dangerous? Reason? Bast asked, dark amusement coloring his voice. No reason. She's got nothing to do with reason. She let him go because it pleased her pride. She wanted him to go out into the mortal world and sing her praises, tell stories about her, pine for her. That's why she let him leave. Ugh, he sighed. I've already told you. Our folk are not famous for our good decisions. Perhaps, Chronicler said. Or perhaps she simply recognized the futility of trying to second-guess the Faire. He made a nonchalant gesture. If whatever you're going to do is wrong, you might as well do whatever you want. Bast sat quietly for a long moment. Then he nodded. Faintly at first, then more firmly. You're right, he said. If everything is going to end in tears anyway, I should do what I want. Bast looked around the room, then came suddenly to his feet. After a moment's searching, he found a thick cloak crumpled on the floor. He gave it a vigorous shake and wrapped it around his shoulders before heading to the window. Then he stopped, came back to the couch, and rummaged in the cushions until he found a bottle of wine. Chronicler looked puzzled. What are you doing? Are you going back to Shep's wake? Bast paused on his way back to the window, seeming almost surprised to see Chronicler still standing there. I am going about my business, he said, tucking the bottle of wine under his arm. He opened the window and swung one foot outside. Don't wait up. Kvothe stepped briskly into his room, closing the door behind himself. He moved about busily. He cleared the cold ashes from the fireplace and set new wood in its place, sparking the fire to life with a fat red sulfur match. He fetched a second blanket and spread it over his narrow bed. Frowning slightly, he picked up the crumpled piece of paper from where it had fallen to the floor and returned it to the top of his desk, where it sat next to the two other crumpled sheets. Then, moving almost reluctantly, he made his way to the foot of his bed. Taking a deep breath, he wiped his hands on his pants and knelt in front of the dark chest that sat there. He rested both hands on the curved lid and closed his eyes, as if listening for something. His shoulders shifted as he tugged against the lid. Nothing happened. Kvothe opened his eyes. His mouth made a grim line. His hands moved again, pulling harder, straining for a long moment before giving up. Expressionless, Kvothe stood and walked to the window that overlooked the woods behind the inn. He slid it open and leaned out, reaching down with both hands. Then he drew himself back inside, clutching a slender wooden box. Brushing away a coating of dust and spiderwebs, he opened the box. Inside lay a key of dark iron and a key of bright copper. Kvothe knelt in front of the chest again and fitted the copper key into the iron lock. With slow precision, he turned it, left, then right, then left again, listening carefully to the faint clicks of some mechanism inside. Then he lifted the iron key and fitted it into the copper plate. This key he did not turn. He slid it deep into the lock, brought it halfway out, then pushed it back before drawing it free in a smooth, quick motion. After replacing the keys in their box, he put his hands back on the sides of the lid in the same position as before. Open, he said under his breath. Open, damn you, Edward. He lifted his back and shoulders, tensing with the effort of it. The lid of the chest didn't budge. Both gave a long sigh and leaned forward until his forehead pressed against the cool, dark wood. As the air rushed out of him, his shoulders sagged, leaving him looking small and wounded, terribly tired and older than his years. His expression, however, showed no surprise, no grief. It was merely resigned. It was the expression of a man who has finally received bad news he'd already known was on the way. Chapter 152, Elderberry. It was a bad night to be caught in the open. The clouds had rolled in late, like a grey sheet pulled across the sky. The wind was chill and gusty, with fits and starts of rain that spattered down heavily before fading into drizzle. For all this, the two soldiers camped in a thicket near the road seemed to be enjoying themselves. They'd found a woodcutter's stash and built their fire so high and hot that the occasional gust of rain did little more than make it spit and hiss. The two men were talking loudly, laughing the wild, braying laughter of men too drunk to care about the weather. Eventually, a third man emerged from the dark trees, stepping delicately over the trunk of a nearby fallen tree. He was wet, if not soaked, and his dark hair was plastered flat to his head. When the soldiers saw him, they lifted their bottles and called out an enthusiastic greeting.
Didn't know if you'd make it, the blonde soldier said. It's a shit night, but it's only fair you get your third. You went through, said the bearded one, lifting up a narrow yellow bottle. Suck on this, it's some fruit thing, but it kicks like a pony. Yours is girly piss, the blonde soldier said, holding up his own. Here, now this here is a man's drink.
The third man looked back and forth as if unable to decide. Finally, he lifted a finger, pointing at one bottle, then the other, as he began to chant, Maple, maple, cactus, ash and ember, elderberry. He ended, pointing at the yellow bottle, then gripped it by the neck and lifted it to his lips. He took a long, slow drink, his throat working silently.
Hey there, said the bearded soldier, save a bit.
Bast lowered the bottle and licked his lips. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle.
You got the right bottle,
he said.
It's elderberry. You're nowhere near as chatty as you were this morning, the blonde soldier said, cocking his head to one side. You look like your dog died. Is everything all right?
No, Bast said. Nothing's all right.
It ain't our fault if he figured it out, the blonde one said quickly. We waited a bit after you left, just like you said, but we've been sitting for hours already. Thought you were never going to leave. Hell, the bearded man said, irritated. Does he know? He throw you out?
Bast shook his head and tipped the bottle back again.
Then you ain't got nothing to complain of.
The blonde soldier rubbed the side of his head, scowling.
Silly bastard gave me a lump or two. He got it back with some to spare.
The bearded soldier grinned, rubbing his thumb across his knuckles.
He'll be pissing blood tomorrow. So it's all good at the end,
the blonde soldier said philosophically, lurching unsteadily as he waved his bottle a little too dramatically.
You got to skin your knuckles. I got a drink of something lovely and we all made a heavy penny. Everyone's happy. Everyone gets what they wanted most.
I didn't get what I wanted, Bast said flatly.
Not yet,
the bearded soldier said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a purse that made a weighty chink as he bounced it in his palm.
Grab a piece of fire and we'll divvy this up.
Bast looked around the circle of firelight, making no move to take it. Then he began to chant again as he pointed at things randomly. A nearby stone, a log, a hatchet. Fallow, farrow, ash and oak, bide and borrow, chimney smoke. He ended pointing at the fire. He stepped close, stooped low, and pulled out a branch longer than his arm. The far end was a solid knot of glowing coal.
Now you're drunker than I am,
The bearded soldier guffawed.
That's not what I meant when I said grab a piece of fire.
The blonde soldier rolled with laughter. Bast looked down at the two men. After a moment, he began to laugh too. It was a terrible sound, jagged and joyless. It was no human laugh.
Oi!
The bearded man interrupted sharply, his expression no longer amused.
What's the matter with you?
It began to rain again, a gust of wind spattering heavy drops against Bast's face. His eyes were dark and intent. There was another gust of wind that made the end of the branch flare a brilliant orange. The hot coal traced a glowing arc through the air as Bast began to point it back and forth between the two men, chanting, "Barrel, barley, stone and stave, wind and water, speak air." Bast finished with the burning branch, pointing at the bearded man. His teeth were red in the firelight. His expression was nothing like a smile. Echelon. A silence of 3 parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet made by things that were lacking. If there had been a steady rain, it would have drummed against the roof, sluiced the eaves, and washed the silence slowly out to sea. If there had been lovers in the beds of the inn, they would have sighed and moaned and shamed the silence into being on its way. If there had been music. But no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things, and so the silence remained. Outside the Waystone, the noise of distant revelry blew faintly through the trees. A strain of fiddle, voices, stomping boots and clapping hands. But the sound was as slender as a thread, and a shift in the wind broke it, leaving only rustling leaves and something almost like the far-off shrieking of an owl. That faded too, leaving nothing but the second silence, waiting like an endless indrawn breath. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the chill metal of a dozen locks turned tight to keep the night away. It lay in rough clay jugs of cider and the hollow taproom gaps where chairs and tables ought to be. It was in the mottling ache of bruises that bloomed across a body. And it was in the hands of the man who wore the bruises, as he rose stiffly from his bed, teeth clenched against the pane. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant, and he moved with the subtle certainty of a thief in the night. He made his way downstairs. There, behind the tightly shuttered windows, he lifted his hands like a dancer, shifted his weight, and slowly took one single, perfect step. The Waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the 3, wrapping the others inside itself. It was deep and as wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river smooth stone. It was the patient, cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. You have been listening to The Wise Man's Fear, The Kingkiller Chronicle, Day 2, by Patrick Rothfuss. Read by Rupert Degas. It is an Orion Audiobooks production. Copyright Orion Publishing. The executive producer was Pandora White. Music, recording, and production was by Peter Rinne.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.
others. I'm listening. Good luck. brings you here. May the stars guide you.
Fuck you and die in hell. Jump from cliff. Make sure you don't survive.